How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 205 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode, I'm delighted to be joined for the second time by Niall Hatch from Birdwatch Ireland. And the last time we recorded was in the very early days of the podcast. It was actually episode 34, which was September 2020, and we were in the midst of lockdowns and semi-lockdowns and whatnot at the time. And we met and had an in-person interview in the East Coast Nature Reserve, the Birdwatch Ireland, the East Coast Nature Reserve. And that to this day is still one of the most popular episodes of the podcast, and anything to do with wild birds, garden birds is hugely popular. But I said we'd get Niall back on now. We're coming into the period of the year. I mentioned it on last week's podcast about jobs to do for the month of November and get your feeding station set up and so on. So we're going to talk about all of that and all of the other, I suppose, good work that Niall and the rest of the team in Birdwatch Ireland are doing. So Niall, you're very, very welcome to Master My Garden podcast.
It's great to be back. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the previous episode as well. I really enjoyed myself. I remember that was such a lifeline for me during that lockdown time. We actually got to go out into the open air in the nature reserve, just have that human contact again and talk to people about nature. It was lovely. So thank you for that.
It was very enjoyable, and I actually flicked back to see what number it was at that time. Because I wanted to just mention it in the intro, and it's episode 34. But I was just looking as I checked back on it. It was just shy of an hour long, so it was definitely one of the longer ones, but still to this day is one of the most popular episodes of the podcast. Is consistently hovering around the top 10, which is quite good at this stage, because in the early days, obviously the podcast was quite new at that stage, so for one of those episodes to be still there, I suppose, is a testament to what we were talking about, and I suppose the interest that people have in birds. At that time, we talked all about feeding, how to feed, how to set up, and we'll talk about all of that again today. But I know at that stage, the garden bird survey was that Birdwatch Ireland do was I think was in its relatively early years, if I'm correct in saying that. But you have your 3 years on from that now, essentially, and there must be a good bit of data starting to build up. So maybe tell us a little bit about that first.
Oh, I will. It's actually been going a very long time, that survey. So it's actually,
okay.
I believe at the moment we're speaking now, the new season just launches today, as it happens. It runs for 13 weeks, but this is actually the 35th season we've done. So the data we get from that is truly phenomenal. We get a huge, huge interest in this from all over the country. And that's how we know so much about Ireland's garden bird populations. It tells us a huge amount about how they're reacting to things like climate change, pollution, all sorts of other disturbance events, things like that, and availability of food. So it tells us a huge amount. It's certainly our flagship citizen science project. It's meaning that it's mobilizing the general public to become scientists and to contribute their data to our conservation efforts. We could never in a million years manage to mobilize that number of professional staff or professional bird surveyors to do this, but we have thousands of people freely giving their own time over the course of the 13 weeks the survey runs each winter, and the data we get from that is truly phenomenal. And because we've been doing it for such a long period of time, the data, you're quite right, it's very interesting, the things that we're seeing. So one of the things that's been quite stark over the last couple of years is we're seeing some birds declining quite severely. One would be a bird called the greenfinch, which has suffered from a pandemic of its own. There's a disease called trichomoniasis that's been hitting that bird very hard. And from the survey over the last few years, we've seen a decline of 47% in that species in Irish gardens over the course of just 10 years. Which is really, really stark. So it just goes to show that even birds that were sometimes once considered common, that's not always the case. People think, I suppose, that in Birdwatch Ireland, we might only be concerned about the really rare birds and trying to save the endangered ones. But the fact is, although that is very important, the fact is you can actually tell a lot more about the health of the environment from the common bird species, because it's in those birds where actually more people will actually see them. We're more likely to spot trends in their populations. So although the birds themselves may remain very common, some are becoming more common, some are becoming less common, or they're changing their distribution. That's very telling. So having that data set built up over such a long period of time with so many people in their own gardens, you don't have to go to some exotic place to do this, in their own gardens, it tells us a huge amount. And it's something I would encourage everyone to do. You can find the details on our website. It's birdwatchireland.ie. It runs for 13 weeks. We'd love you to do as many of those weeks as possible. Whatever data you can give us is great. Sometimes people tell us, I don't have any birds in my garden. There's no point in me doing the survey. That's data. The absence of birds is important information as well. So there's no excuse. Anyone can take part, really.
And so just to talk about how, and I'm going to go back to what you mentioned there a second ago, but just to how the survey works. So somebody signs up, they get a check sheet, I guess, of what you have in your garden. I suppose, does that include, what trees, hedges, is that type of thing? And then from there, there's a checklist of birds. Is that how it works?
That's it in a nutshell. Yes, absolutely. So there's two ways you can take part. You can download a PDF from our website and print it off and have a paper form, which a lot of people like to do. Or do that's it's printed in the winter issue of our Birdwatch Wings magazine that goes out to our members each winter as well. Or you can take part purely online. We have an online portal that works very well. You can log in there and put your sightings in of the birds. So whatever's the easiest for you to get the data to us. And yes, the first part of the survey, it's a questionnaire about the size of your garden, what sort of food, if any, you put out for the birds, if you put out water for them, and in very simple terms, what kind of plants are there, particularly if you have plants that have berries on them. So it's not very technical at all. It's just sort of general overview of that kind of thing, and of course, where in the country you are. So we're able to
Location,
put your data in context. Exactly, yeah. So and air codes have made that a lot simpler now than they did in the early years of the survey. So it's actually very
more precise.
Precisely.
You mentioned greenfinch is one bird that's declining because of a disease within the greenfinch. Is that unique to greenfinches, or does it also affect other finches?
It does affect other finches, but the greenfinches seem to get it worst. So we know that all finch species that come into our garden are susceptible to this. Some other birds like sparrows, pigeons, and hawks, they can catch it as well. Most birds, it seems, are immune. So your blackbirds, your robins, your blue tits, they don't seem to have anything to fear from this disease. And I should stress that we humans as well have nothing to fear. Mammals like ourselves can't be affected. So we're fine. So our cats, dogs, guinea pigs, sheep, cows, horses, all of these, nothing can affect them with this in terms of this disease. It's thought that one of the reasons why it affects the greenfinches worse than other types of finch is that greenfinches in the winter, when they're flocking, it seems that sometimes they pass food from beak to beak to strengthen this flock bond, and they pass the infection when they do that. So they have more close contact than some of the other finches do. It's a waterborne disease, so it's spread by infected saliva, and so it can get into bird baths or drinking puddles as well. Very important to keep your feeders and your bird baths very clean to prevent the spread of this disease, or at least to limit it. People often ask what kind of disease it is. It's not a bacterium, it's not a virus, it's actually a single-celled organism, a protozoan, a bit like an amoeba, and it infects the bird's throats and eventually causes swellings that are so severe the bird can no longer swallow, so it can't feed and it dies. It's a horrible disease. And part of the survey, just a few years ago, we added this question: have you seen birds showing symptoms of this, or sick birds in your garden, to help try track the spread of it too.
The reason I was asking specifically about finches is because greenfinches have never really been a feature here for some reason. I've never seen them down through the years. But on the flip side of that, we've never had as many chaffinches, and particularly goldfinches, never had as many. So I suppose, interesting enough, since the last time we spoke, I know we spoke a little bit during that episode on buzzards and how they were growing in popularity. And again, at that stage, we wouldn't have seen too many buzzards where I am, but I knew they were sort of in the vicinity. But very recently, in the last 2 years, they have got quite plentiful around here. I would say very plentiful around here. And another one, which was really interesting, it's not widespread yet, but you talked about the woodpecker coming back across and starting to track sort of across Ireland at that point. And I live County Laois, not far from Carlow town, just for geographical location. And I still haven't seen one, but a friend of mine who lives a mile away sent me a picture one day, and he said, "What's this on my feeder?" And it was a woodpecker. So I was delighted to see that. I presume those trends are continuing. The buzzard is getting more plentiful still, and the woodpecker is starting to move across further. Is that what you're seeing?
Very much so. Yes, that's absolutely right. So they're both big success stories of recent years. In the case of the buzzard, it's a recolonization. Those once a species, if you went back a few centuries, would have been a very common bird in Ireland. For those who don't know it, it's a bird of prey. It's quite a large bird of prey, a wingspan of about a meter, a big hawk. We record them in the Irish Garden Bird Survey because they do fly over people's gardens, and we ask people to record any birds of prey that they see there. But people are probably more familiar with them, maybe seeing them along the sides of motorways, perched on lampposts, or sometimes circling high in the sky in the spring, where they make the sort of, it sounds like the sort of call they have is like a cat mewing in the distance. It's a very plaintive kind of sound. And that's a species that was persecuted to virtual extinction in Ireland over the course of the 20th century. But since that persecution has been stopped in many cases, some illegal killing of them does still occur, but it's mostly stopped. And what's happened is those birds have managed to recolonize most of Ireland. And they hung on just in the northern part of County Antrim. When they've colonised down through Ulster and East Leinster from there, possibly aided by an influx of birds from Britain, where it's a very common species. Now they're breeding again in all 32 counties, and the density is increasing. And what's happening is that they're sort of taking back, to an extent, their share of the ecosystem from the crows. In the absence of buzzards, crows were able to grow to very large numbers, very high density of hooded crows, jackdaws, and rooks, particularly, as well as magpies, because they were able to scavenge on the roadkill. They were able to have the first pick of the roadkill and the rodents and things like that. But as buzzards are returning, what we're finding is it's putting manners on the crows to a degree, and it's also reducing some of that food. It's more of a natural balance. That is a real success story. With the great spotted woodpecker, that's as far as we know, nobody's quite certain, but there's no guaranteed evidence that species was ever present as a breeding bird in Ireland before. It may have been centuries ago, but nobody's quite certain. It's very hard to find records like that. What we can say for sure now is it is spreading, and it's probably only a matter of time before you do see them in your own garden, especially if they're as close to you as a mile. They're becoming, in Carlow particularly, they're becoming relatively widespread. That's a species which colonized, we know for sure, from genetic work from Britain. And it's the Irish Garden Bird Survey has allowed us to track the spread of that species, because over the last 10 years or so, we're seeing it creeping up the rankings in the table all the time. For those who don't know it, it's sort of a medium-sized black and white bird, roughly the size of a blackbird, with a very different body shape, much shorter tail, a longer beak. So mostly black and white, with a patch of red just on the lower part of the belly, just above its tail. And then the males also have a patch of red on the back of their head. The female has no red on her head. And then the juveniles, the young birds, just when they've left the nest in sort of midsummer, they have red on top of their head. So that's how you can tell the difference between the three types. And it made landfall around 2005, we think. What happened was, it's a very common bird in Britain, very common bird all across Britain, and indeed much of Europe and Asia. And the woodpeckers don't like to fly across water if they can avoid it. They just have a real reluctance to do that. But it seems the population density in Britain got so high that young birds just had nowhere to go. They weren't going to find a territory. And what we saw was that the 2 points where you can see Ireland easily enough from Britain. So it was some birds from Wales could see the Wicklow Mountains and flew across to Wicklow. And then other birds from Scotland could see County Down and flew across there. Okay. Since then, these two populations have slowly but surely been building in number. They found very little by way of competition. They have a whole ecosystem that no other type of woodpecker is using. So slowly but surely they're starting to spread, and now they're present across much of Ireland, although the highest densities are still in the East Coast. But it's a matter of time, I'd say, before they're everywhere in Ireland.
Yeah, and obviously they like wooded areas.
They do. Yeah, they do, because they're one of the most important foods for them is beetle larvae. So beetles in tree bark or under the bark, especially in dead trees. They drill on the trees to take those out, but they also excavate holes in trees in which they will nest. So it's very important that they have access to those. We're starting to see them using things like telegraph poles as well, where they can't find enough trees. Right. And then in the autumn and the winter, actually quite an important food for them would be pine cones. They love to eat the pine nuts that are in the cones. But what we're finding more and more is that they're actually quite happy to come down to feeders in gardens. So they'll feed on peanuts, and they particularly love suet blocks, or those fat balls you get. That's a high fat, high energy food source. They absolutely love that. So through the survey, we're seeing more and more people now reporting these strange black and white birds from their gardens and wondering what they are. It's really, really interesting. Yeah,
for sure. Just before we finish on the bird survey, is there anything else obvious that's sort of has changed over the last few years? Anything in decline, anything increasing quite a lot of the say the obvious birds?
Well, what's interesting is that there's a lot of stability at the top of the table. The top three bird species in terms of the number of gardens in which they're present, they're almost always the same, and they have been for 35 years. So almost always at number one, it's the robin. And it's usually then in either second place or third place, you have the blackbird or the blue tit. Sometimes they alternate. But that's sort of the general rule. And those are three very common, very easy to observe birds in gardens. I think that, what the survey does is it shows us the number of gardens they're present in, but also you can tell a little bit about the numbers you're seeing. So most gardens, the vast majority, over 99%, will have a robin in them, but usually it's only one robin. whereas it may be, a smaller percentage may have something like chaffinches, but you might have 20 of them because they tend to flock, whereas robins are very solitary. So it's very interesting to see that, and also how it differs regionally. Some areas of the coast, you'll see the birds retreating there when it gets particularly cold. In the Midlands, for example, you'll see birds responding to weather events. So that is quite interesting. We have been seeing some other increases, sort of in tandem and probably linked to the decline in the greenfinches. Another finch called the linnet over the same period of time has been increasing in gardens. And the theory we have there, we need more investigation of this, but the theory is that actually the greenfinches are more dominant and slightly bigger than the linnets, so they kind of keep them away from the gardens. But if the greenfinches disappear from those gardens, well, nature abhors a vacuum, it allows an opportunity for those linnets to come in and start taking that food that otherwise the greenfinches would have. So there's winners and losers all the time. You see sometimes that if one species declines, it's a benefit to another species. We wouldn't know this without the thousands of people taking part in the survey. So to all of your listeners who've done this for us already, thank you so much. And if you haven't, please give it a go. It's a lot of fun. I will warn you, it becomes incredibly addictive. You become obsessed with watching out the window. When you see new species you haven't had in the survey yet, it's amazing how much of a buzz that can give you. But then the data you're giving us, it's invaluable. It really helps us to see how the birds are doing and what we can do to help them.
Yeah, brilliant. So we're going to chat now about, I suppose, how to attract in birds or more birds into your garden. And I'll tell you, we spoke about it the last time, where we were talking about habitat loss being a factor, a big factor in certain types of bird and nature generally decreasing. And this year I had in the garden, now they didn't stay very long, but I had 2 bullfinches here for a couple of months on a new wildflower meadow that I sowed. So it was a native Irish wildflower meadow, and I actually sowed it. Sorry, I sowed it last year, but this was the second year, and it was unbelievable, the bird activity on that, which I suppose to me suggests very strongly that habitat is hugely important. And okay, it's a food source, but it's also a habitat. So the insects were there because of the wildflowers. The seed heads were there on the wildflowers that had gone over, and both of that, the insects and the seeds, were obviously a food source and a habitat for insects, which in turn brought in the birds, and which resulted in 2 bullfinches, which, as I say, I only saw for a couple of weeks, but it was very exciting to see them for the first time in the garden.
Yes, and the bullfinch is one species that the survey has shown us just in the last few years is starting to increase on garden feeders as well. It seems it's taken that finch a bit of time to work out what feeders were, but I actually think, yes, that what's bringing them to gardens more and more, it is people planting wildflower meadows. And also no mow May has been a real boon for the bullfinches too, because one of their favorite foods of all are dandelion seeds.
Yes.
They absolutely love them. And it's actually really endearing to watch them go down onto your lawn and pluck off the little seeds one by one from the seed heads. It's very dainty. I really like bullfinches. They're one of our most colorful garden birds, but they're also quite shy and retiring. And they're virtually always in pairs. It's rare to see one by itself.
Exactly.
So most birds, they come to get together during the breeding season. They're not particularly faithful, but bullfinches are monogamous and they mate for life. And so if you see one of them, its partner is probably just a few feet away at most. And it adds a splash of color to any garden. Really, really beautiful little bird, one of my favorites. And I'm glad you can see the benefits of those native plants.
Yeah, for sure.
I think you're absolutely right. It's about recreating these habitats. The fact of it is that our native birds evolved alongside those native plants and the native insects that rely on those plants, and it's all part of an ecosystem. These plants also provide seeds. They provide leaf shoots and buds and flowers for some of the species that eat those. Bullfinches like to eat flowers a lot. They often eat blossom on prunus trees and things like that, and on apples. That's sort of a factor that's often missing from gardens. And but putting out some wildflower seed and cultivating a wildflower meadow is a great way to track those in. And in doing that, what they're doing too is they're helping to control some of the pests that are in your garden. There's a bird called a dunnock, for example, and its favorite food would be aphids, greenfly and blackfly and so on. So a great species to have in your garden, and you can encourage them by providing wildflowers and other native plants that also not just provide food in the form of berries, insects, or seeds, but also provide cover. Because a lot of these insect-eating birds, life for them in the winter is very tough, especially because when it's raining or when it's very cold, it's much harder for them to find insects. The insects will be sheltering in those native plants, and that's how they'll find them. But also having some evergreen plants that will provide year-round cover really helps those birds to survive the worst that winter can throw at them. Our birds are amazing. They can survive temperatures of -30 without any problem whatsoever. Far worse than what Ireland can throw at them, provided they have enough food and shelter. If they don't get that, then they'll perish. So making sure that those boxes are ticked, that's very important. And of course, making sure they have water as well. That's a big limiting factor for a lot of our birds, because when the temperatures drop below freezing, the water disappears. It turns to ice and they don't have access to it. They need to drink it and they need to bathe in it. And the colder it gets, the more frequently those birds have to bathe, because those feathers need to be in perfect condition without any dust or dirt in them, because the more dirtier they are, the worse the insulating properties are. And so then when the cold weather comes at night and the temperatures drop, if the feathers have any dirt or damage or holes in them, it means that they'll be susceptible to hypothermia, which is a big killer of lots of birds. But if the feathers are in tip-top condition, then they'll survive those cold nights without much problem, but they can only do that if they have access to water.
Brilliant. Yeah, you're linking lots of things for me. I'm going to stay going back here a little bit. The first thing I actually we watched the documentary last night. It was a David Attenborough one, and I only caught the last bit of it. But there was two birds. I don't exactly know what birds they were. I missed the very start of it. But when I turned it on, they were fighting, and one of the ways they initially tried to throw one another off the cliff. This is at the edge of a sea, and when that failed, when they weren't able to separate, one of them wasn't able to throw the other off, they got sick on one another, which was amazing to see and very funny looking on the video. But the reason, so one of them then obviously headed away, and the first thing they did was they went to the snow and they rolled in the snow and they rolled in the snow to get that off, because that's what they said, was that dirty feathers, when they freeze, have no insulating property and they wouldn't last overnight. So that's really interesting that you just said that. And that's why birds needs to use bird baths, which is interesting. But the second thing that you mentioned just previous to that, I didn't realize Dunnocks were so beneficial in the garden. I have raised beds quite near where that wildflower meadow was, and another vegetable garden at the back. And down the back, I would have netted some of the brassicas, the cabbage, the cauliflower, and so on, for cabbage white butterfly, and I didn't have any issues there. But I didn't net the other ones, and I had absolutely no pests. And I was putting it down to the fact that it was so close to the wildflower meadow that I was getting the blue tits coming in, taking off the caterpillars, and other birds doing that. It has to be the reason, because I've had it every other year, except now when this wildflower meadow has gone into position. So there's real benefits that you kind of don't expect to get from your wildflower meadow.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that's absolutely right. I think that when we restore these natural ecosystems, we see all of these ecosystem benefits. These birds are more than happy to help us to control these garden pests, because of course, in a natural setting, these creatures aren't pests at all. Everything's in balance, and you don't have too much of one thing or too little of another thing. It all works naturally. It's we humans that have upset that balance, and therefore in our gardens, it means that we end up using more chemicals and having to do a lot more work, where in fact nature will do a lot of that for us. It just, it's just about making sure that you make space for nature and that you can allow it to thrive. The blue tits you mentioned there and their fondness for caterpillars, that's something that really amazes me. So blue tits, they're a very common bird in Ireland. There's at least 1.1 million pairs of them nest in Ireland. We always count birds in breeding pairs. So if you talk about that, that's 2.2 million breeding adults, and then some non-breeders, and then at the end of the summer you have all the juveniles that join their parents in that population. So they time their nesting season sort of very end of April into May, during that time, and they have to, those 1.1 million pairs of blue tits, they in a space of just 2 weeks have to find between 10,000 and 20,000 caterpillars to feed to their chicks.
Wow.
You think about that, over the space of just 2 weeks, 1.1 million pairs, each consuming up to 20,000 caterpillars. It's an astonishing number. And if it wasn't for the blue tits doing that, where would our gardens be? Where would our agriculture be? Using even more chemicals than it does already. I think that people often don't realize they take these birds for granted, and because we get these ecosystem services for free, we take them for granted and we don't really value them. If they were to disappear, we'd soon regret it. It's like what we see with pollination by insects as well. It's something that's worth countless billions to the economy, but something we take for granted. But if it ever disappears, we'll certainly regret it, definitely.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal amount, and definitely makes sense now as to why I didn't have any issue there. So anyone that's, and I've a a grow your own food course coming out in the next couple of weeks, and that is a key part of it, is building up the biodiversity in the area to get those natural benefits. But it's real, like it's not, as you said there, if there's that much, if they need that much caterpillars during that period of time, it really is a huge benefit to your garden, and you should be doing everything you can, I suppose, to put the ecosystem in place so that you get that benefit.
Oh yes, and the great thing with blue tits particularly, and their close relatives, the grey tits and the coal tits, which also have a voracious appetite for caterpillars. One way you can really help them and really give a good chance of them coming into your garden is to put up a nest box for them, because one of the limiting factors on those species is nest sites. And putting up a good nest box, just one in your garden, and that almost, it's almost a guarantee, but it's a very good chance they'll come and nest, and then they'll have food in terms of caterpillars and other insects right on the doorstep, right there in your garden. It's a good way to get them cleaned out. I've gone even so far in my own garden. I live in North County Wicklow. It's got a very small garden with room just for one nest box. I have it on my back wall, and I plant what I call my sacrificial cabbages. I actually put cabbages out deliberately, which aren't netted or anything. I let the white butterflies come in, lay their eggs all over them, crawling with caterpillars. Those blue tits come down, they feed it, they clear them off in a day or two, but it means that they have a good reason to nest where I want them to nest, and then they clean out all the other pests as well. So it's something very easy to do. It's very cheap, very cost effective, and far more environmentally friendly than using chemicals, and also driving yourself nuts trying to control all these pests and so on, when the birds will do it for you for free.
Yeah,
grateful
brilliant. We'll talk about nesting boxes in a minute. Just in terms of feeding then, so I've spoke about it several times on the podcast before. What foods do you guys recommend? I know back a number of years ago there was a lot of talk about that we shouldn't feed the birds too much, that they need to get their own food sources. And I know the recommendation from bird bodies all over Europe now is that we should definitely supplement feed, because there is a shortage of natural foods typically. So
yeah, that's it, absolutely. So the birds that come into our bird feeders, they're coming there because they need the food. Essentially, they wouldn't, if there was enough natural food out there, that they wouldn't need to do that, and that would always be their first option. And indeed, even though it may look like the birds are coming and going from your feeders all day long, they actually are still mostly eating food that they find out in the wild. They just use it to supplement their diets and give them that extra boost. But then when really cold weather hits, or if it's raining for several days in a row, then it can become a real lifeline, because then they realize, well, actually there's a reliable source of food that I can eat here. And you're looking for stuff that's really calorie rich. That's what benefits them the most. The real key, I suppose, is variety. The more different types of food you put out for the birds, the more different species you'll attract in, because each one of them has evolved its own niche, its own dietary requirements. So I would say there's a few staples in gardens that work very well. So peanuts, number one. That's a really good source of food. There's many birds like to eat those. They're very high in protein. They're very high in oils, so fat, which is very important. They need the high calories, and they're very easy to feed to birds. Just a word of warning: to never put them out loose. Always put them in the wire mesh feeders, because it's dangerous. If a bird could take a whole peanut and it tries to swallow it, it could easily choke on that. But if it can just take a little beakful at a time, there's no risk of choking. And it makes the food go a lot further as well. So that works very well. Now, I know that the price of peanuts is going up and up all the time. They're not cheap. So, don't worry if you don't want to feed peanuts, because even better again would be sunflower seeds. Sunflower seeds work really well. There's lots of other seed mixes you can get. We sell loads of them through the Birdwatch Ireland shop. You find a whole range there, but perennially our best seller is pure sunflower seed, because with that there's very little by way of waste. The birds want to eat them. Now, people think that they're wasting them. They don't eat the husk. They don't eat the kernel. They eat the kernel. They don't eat the husk outside it. So you'll see all the husk being discarded on the ground, and that can look like a lot of waste, but in fact that's the birds just eating the seed inside, as they would in the wild. You can actually get a commercial product now that they call it sunflower hearts. It's just a fancy word for pre-shelled sunflower seeds, and they're even easier for those birds to eat, so they absolutely love them. They're a real favorite of the bullfinches that we were mentioning earlier. It's a good way to attract them into your garden. Suet works very well too. So suet is the fat from around the animal's kidneys, and it's available from butchers, but you get lots of commercially available suet treats and fat balls, all of these. The reason why suet is chosen is because it's very solid, even at room temperature. It doesn't melt as easily as other fats do. So that means that there's no chance of it melting on the bird's feathers and fouling them or going rancid easily. So that helps there. Fruit is another great thing for birds, apples particularly. So if you find some apples, if they happen to be a bit past their best, a bit wrinkled, a bit bruised, so much the better. You can sometimes get those as bargains in supermarkets that they're going to throw out. And what I like to do is either put them whole on the lawn or cut them in half and spear them onto branches. And members of the thrush family, like the blackbird, song thrush, the mistle thrush, two other winter visitors called the redwing and the fieldfare, they'll come and they'll feed on those. They like them very much. And also another bird called the blackcap, a small warbler, which used to only be present in Ireland in the summer, but now is spending the winter in Ireland as well. These gardens foods can be a real lifeline for them, and they particularly love apples. Why they're so successful is that a lot of these birds, particularly the migratory thrushes I mentioned there, the fieldfare and the redwing, they come to us from much further north. They don't breed in Ireland, they migrate here for the winter. They're not used to people feeding them. When they arrive in a garden, they don't know what peanuts are. They don't know what the seeds are. It's not what they eat. They'll eat worms, but if it's frozen over on the ground, they can't find those. But they do recognize apples because in the wild, they would eat crab apples. And when they see a domestic eating apple, they just think, well, that looks like a big crab apple, which essentially is what it is. And they realize they can eat that. And what we find is if we do get a sudden cold spell, like when we had the beast from the east, these birds will flock in their thousands into gardens, sometimes just as a last refuge, the last place where they could possibly find food. And if they find apples there, they'll survive. Because we had many tragic cases where these birds were in gardens, they were around bird tables, there was food all over the place, but they didn't recognize it as edible, and they starved to death because they didn't know they could eat that food. But with apples, at least they know that they can. So there are a few tips I mentioned earlier with water. That's also really, really important. Even other fruits like bananas, things like that, they can work very, very well. And so can a lot of leftover food too. I know a lot of people like to put out bread for the birds. I wouldn't be my top recommendation. White sliced pan isn't great food for birds. In small quantities, it's not harmful, but if it forms the major part of their diet, it's not good because it's basically empty calories in a way. There's lots of carbohydrate there, but there's very little by way of vitamins and other minerals. There's very little by way of protein, so it's difficult for them, and even very little by way of fat. So it's difficult for them to survive. As a stopgap, bread can help. Better to use wholemeal or whole grain bread if you can, rather than white bread. But what I actually prefer again is actually stale cake. And in the Christmas not far away, perhaps people may find themselves with an abundance of Christmas cake or Christmas pudding around, and birds love that. It's full of sugar, full of fat, full of fruit, ideal for birds. Just one word of warning there as well. Christmas cake and Christmas puddings contain raisins and sultanas, and they're fine for birds, they're fine for humans, but they're very toxic to dogs. So if you have a dog or if you have foxes visiting your garden, I would avoid doing that in case any of the scraps hit the ground. If a dog eats a few raisins, it could die. So it's just use caution, but for the birds, it's absolutely fine.
Yeah, brilliant. And so they're and it's correct. Like the more diversity of food, the bigger the diversity of birds that you'll have for sure. In terms of feed or setting up bird boxes, so I think this is something that's underutilized, I would think, and there's probably a case of there's a lot of bird boxes going up just because of their decorative properties. They get these fancy ones which they look pretty, but they actually have no probably benefit to birds. So maybe just talk a little bit about that and choosing the correct ones.
Yes, it's a big bugbear of mine, actually. So I'm glad you've asked me about it because, yes, you do often see nest boxes on sale where it's very much form over function, where they've gone like a little replica of a house or some sort of cabin. If the basic criteria are met, that the birds don't really care what the outside looks like. So it is possible to have a decorative nest box that's also very functional, but unfortunately a lot of them aren't. So one of the ones that really gets me, you see something made of like half a coconut shell or something like that, that's absolutely useless. The birds just won't, it just doesn't meet the needs. Anything that's made of woven wicker that's full of holes, no, just won't work. The birds basically want a fortress. So you're talking about something that's made just of good solid plywood, where it's nice and sealed. You want to make sure, ideally, that it has a sloping roof on the top of it, so that if any water lands on it, which let's face it, in Ireland it will, it'll drain off very easily. It won't soak into the box. It has an opportunity just to fall off the roof. You want to have the hole in the box quite high up, so that when the water does drip off the roof, it falls past the hole rather than going into it. And a very simple way to sort of maximize the benefits of that roof is angle the box forward slightly. Just a few degrees of an angle will mean the water is much less likely to go into the hole. You want to make sure it has a few drainage holes in the bottom, because inevitably some water will get in, and you want to make sure that it can air dry very quickly, so it doesn't chill, so fungus doesn't grow inside, that kind of thing. So that's a good way to make sure the eggs and the chicks are protected in there. That's really important. And one of the things then, you want to make sure that you have the right style of box for the species that you're trying to attract or that are in your area. The blue tit is a very good one to start with because every garden in Ireland has a good chance of attracting that in. It's a very common and widespread species, and it also readily uses nest boxes. But one of the pitfalls you see is very often the hole in the box, the entrance hole, is too small for the I said again. Very often the entrance hole is too big for the bird. The birds
Okay.
are very sensitive to that, actually, because a bird isn't happy to go inside a nest box hole or a cavity that a larger, more dominant species could evict it from.
Yes.
So in the case of the blue tit, they're feisty little guys, but the great tit, which is a bit bigger, a close cousin of theirs, it would happily evict them and kick them out of a nest hole. But however, if the hole is small enough, then the great tit won't fit in, but blue tit can. So for blue tit, you're looking for the hole to be 25 millimeters across. That's an inch in diameter. But when
Okay.
you look at that, it looks like that's way too small. There's no way the bird could fit through that.
Yeah.
But it can, because that bird is tiny. When you look at that bird too, you have to remember mostly what you're seeing is feathers that have been fluffed up with air below them. The actual bird's muscles and skeleton below that are really tiny. They can fit through that gap with no problem, but the great tits and the sparrows can't get into a victim. So that's
Yeah.
a good option there. When it comes to locating those boxes where you should situate them in a garden, for those ones that are basically fortresses with a hole in the top, it's not that important. You want to have them out of the prevailing wind, slightly shaded, as high up as you can get them, so making sure they're not near anywhere where a cat or something can get to them easily. They probably won't be able to get into the box if it's well built, but there's a chance they could swipe the youngsters as they're trying to come out and take their first flight. But they don't mind too much because they're so protected inside the box.
Mm-hmm.
For other birds like robins, for example, and blackbirds, they won't nest inside a cavity like that. They want to have an open front on the nest box. It's much more open, usually with a little lip or a shelf in the front to stop the nest or the chicks from falling out. But you want to have it so that therefore that it's actually quite secluded. You want to have it ideally then lower down, maybe behind something prickly like a bramble, some brambles or a holly bush or something like that. That makes it much harder for cats or foxes or other predators to sneak up and get inside. So for them, it's a bit more trying to keep it semi-hidden and protected. These birds will find them. They're very good at seeking out nest sites. So give it a go. And in terms of timing, we normally say, as a rule of thumb, you want to have your nest box in place by the middle of February. So Valentine's Day, 14th of February is a good sort of benchmark for that. So it's a great project to do over the winter. Anytime over the Christmas, you find yourself with a few minutes to spare, put up a nest box in your garden, let it weather in for a few months. And what happens is those birds in the late winter, early spring, when they're going around looking for food, they're keeping a mental note of potential nesting sites. And if they see the box there, they think, oh, we should check that out in a few weeks. It could be a good place to nest. So that often works well. So people often think that, it's just put them up just before the nesting season in April or May, but that's too late. The birds have already decided where they're going to nest by that stage.
Brilliant. And another thing that we spoke about previously, and it's only recently that I've in the last 2 years, I've really noticed the benefits of it. Positioning of your wild bird feeders is massively important, and we did speak about this previously. But where I see it, so I've 2 feeding stations essentially. Now they're quite close to one another, so I just call it the one station. It's two big bird tables, each with 4 feeders on it. Sorry, 4 on one, 3 on the other, and they're positioned about 2 meters from a good solid hedge, and then right behind that, maybe 3 meters away, is the natural hedge, fully grown trees and so on. And that there's 2 things that sort of spring to mind. Obviously, we have the rule, which is gardeners still think that it doesn't apply to them, where you don't cut your hedge from, is it the 1st of March to the 1st of September?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So gardeners still think that rule doesn't apply, but it's hugely important if it's, for your nesting boxes, because any disturbance, even if it's only a light trim on the outside, the birds don't like that. I definitely noticed that. It also, that hedge that's quite close to my feeding area, the birds use that as a getaway. So I have a Jack Russell. Jack Russell rarely has any success, but in the early days would have had, looking towards the feeders for something to catch. But she still regularly has a go. But I just noticed now that the birds are used to it, and the minute they see any activity, it's just a quick little 2-second flight right into the center of the hedge, and they're protected. So I suppose there's 2 things: position your feeders somewhere where they do have these getaways, that they're not left open and vulnerable. And the other predator that I had for a little while around here was the sparrowhawk. And what I found with that was one of those feeding stations, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but what it seemed to be was that the sparrowhawk came in a sort of a swooping action, and they like to fly through where the feeder is, grab the bird, and continue to flight out the other side.
Yes.
And one of the feeding stations was right in front of the hedge, so that wasn't possible. They would have had to come through and then go up really quickly to get out. But the other one was actually slightly further forward. And if they came at a certain angle, they could make that continuous fly through. And I did have, for a couple of weeks, this situation where they were flying through and grabbing the birds. Now, I know that's natural and all the rest of it, but when you're feeding them, you don't like to see them getting taken away. So I moved it back in slightly, and that stopped completely. So positioning seems to be very important.
You're absolutely right. Yes. So hedges like that are amazingly important for birds, both as an escape route, a place they can go to where they're protected when danger comes, but also a safe place for them to wait their turn when they're going for the feeder. They'll queue up inside the hedge because, again, there's literally a pecking order at the feeder. So the more dominant birds, like the great tits, the robins, they'll be able to move in and take food, but they come and go all the time. And you'll have the smaller birds like your coal tits and species like that. They're waiting until there's a gap, and then they'll dash in and grab food. They can retreat back to the hedge. So that works very well.
Oh, that makes sense now. Yeah, because I wondered why that was the case. Why some of them were sitting on the outside of the hedge, looking and waiting. But now that makes sense. So I didn't realize that. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. The waiting and the sort of the sort of natural pecking order does evolve at and it's great. You can see these dynamics if you watch them. You can see how they react to each other and which bird is more frightened of others and which species are bolder and braver. Then of course when the sparrowhawk arrives, they all scarper. So the sparrowhawk, it's our most common bird of prey. They're very widespread in Ireland. Most of us do get them in our gardens from time to time. Of course, there's nothing wrong with them whatsoever with them in killing small birds. That's what they feed on. It's perfectly natural that they do that. When people get upset about it, I mean, I understand that it's not something you want to see happen in your garden, but all of our birds are predators at some stages in their lives, at least. And what I would say is something like a blue tit. It's a really voracious predator. We just talked earlier of how many tens of thousands of caterpillars, baby butterflies, they're murdering each year. They end far more lives than sparrowhawks do. But of course, we humans, it's not for us. It'd be wrong for us to put human morals on these birds and criticize the way they live. I mean, many of us eat meat and not necessarily in sustainable ways, and we're predators as well. We're just kind of, most of us are more divorced from the predator-prey relationship and the killing than our wild counterparts. So sparrowhawks doing that, it is perfectly normal and natural. But I do understand how people don't want to see that, or they feel bad they've attracted these small birds into their garden and they've been picked off by the sparrowhawk. So I think what you're saying there, trying to interrupt those flight paths, that can certainly help. I'm always torn with that too, because our sparrowhawks do need help as well. They've every bit as much right to survive. And one thing, if people do have the sparrowhawks causing this problem in their garden, the comfort to take from that is that the sparrowhawk would kill the same number of birds anyway. They'd eat one, maybe two a day. And if your feeder wasn't there, they'd catch them somewhere else. It just happens to be, you see it happening in front of you, but it's happening all the time anyway. But no, I absolutely see your point. And actually, yes, it's it can make them very vulnerable. Particularly a poorly located feeder just becomes like target practice for a sparrowhawk. So from that point of view, I think you did exactly the right thing. And moving the feeders, making sure that those swooping routes are blocked off, that can really help. Yeah, definitely.
And they are, while, as I said, when you're feeding the wild birds, it feels a little bit funny to see them being taken away. So that's why I moved it. But the sparrowhawk in itself is a beautiful bird. And the flying path, the flying motions of it are beautiful, really beautiful. So, and it is nature. I completely understand that. But when you are feeding them, I guess you try to protect what you're feeding a little bit. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the other, I don't know, this doesn't fall under sort of bird watching as such, but I've had a huge increase in bats recently around my house. That's not really, I guess, it doesn't fall under bird watching anyway, so doesn't it? It's not.
No, it doesn't, but it certainly falls under conservation. And in Birdwatch Ireland, we're very much about what we call birds plus. So the birds are real flagship and ambassadors for our ecosystem, the most visible form of wildlife that we have. And so what we do, Birdwatch Ireland, we're about conserving and protecting Ireland's wild birds and their habitats. And we're protecting those habitats not just for the birds, but also for all sorts of other animals, including bats, which are a very important part of our ecosystem. And I'm guessing that your wildflower meadow is playing an important role there too, because the bats, they feed on insects, flying insects. And so native plants attract native insects, which attract bats. And bats, they're amazing to have around. They do such a service for us in terms of hoovering up things like mosquitoes. I'm always constantly amazed that people often think that mosquitoes are just something you get when you're abroad. We have 12 different species of mosquitoes in Ireland. I'm constantly getting bitten by them in the summer. And the bats help to hoover those up, as do birds like swallows and swifts. So, they do us a service there. And having native plants, it's a great way to benefit them. You can also get bat roosting boxes, a bit like a nest box for birds, but these are ones for bats to sleep in. Most of them sleep during the day, of course. And putting them up around the garden can really help. They're usually not quite as successful in terms of the take-up rate as bird nest boxes would be. And it can take a bit longer, maybe a few years for the bats to learn what they are. But give it a go, and it's certainly worth your while. And bats are amazing. I almost think of them like honorary birds. They're flying mammals. They're amazing.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I don't mind having them. A lot of people, when I tell them that I have bats, they're not, because they have this perception of them getting caught in their hair, and that, which I don't believe to be true either. But
no, it's not.
Yeah,
there's no downside to bats whatsoever. So there's a lot of fear around them, and there is something that I suppose that's very otherworldly about them. Sadly for myself, it's a long time since I've had to worry about anything getting caught in my hair. I don't have very much of it. No, there's no truth to that old story that bats get caught in people's hair. I think what happened was that people would often see bats swooping close to their heads, because very often we have mosquitoes and midges around us. And the bats are actually coming in to eat those, and they can swoop very close to your head, and that can be scary. But the bat knows exactly where you are. Their eyesight is good. Their echolocation ability, where they use their sonar to find out where they are, is also amazing. They won't hit you. They will roost in attic spaces sometimes, and places like that, and roof spaces and so on. But they don't cause any damage when they're there at all. Yeah. Their droppings are very dry. They don't cause any kind of disease. And the fact of that is too that it's mostly things like beetle skeletons and things like that, like the exoskeletons. It doesn't sound very pleasant, but it's no danger whatsoever. They don't spread any kind of disease. The ones we have in Ireland don't drink your blood, nothing like that. So they're actually completely harmless, nothing but a benefit. So I hope that fear of bats will disappear, because there's no reason to be frightened of bats. There's nothing to fear from them at all.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else that's stepping outside of garden birds? What are you guys seeing across Ireland? Improvements, anything that's recognizable to people, but maybe under a bit of pressure, or anything that's having a roaring success over the last few years? I know you were working on, the last time we spoke, there was a bit of work on was it the corncrake you were trying to reestablish? Right. How's things like that going?
Corncrakes, they're doing okay. The population of corncrakes has declined massively in Ireland. It was once a very, very common bird, a bird very much associated with farmland and a particular type of farming. And the decline in tillage farming, the decline particularly in hay meadows, in favor of silage and of cattle, that has really hit that bird very, very hard. So the corncrake is a bird that declines astronomical. Back, there was a survey done in around 1950, and they found there were 50,000 pairs of corncrakes in Ireland at that time. Today, there's maybe 120, 130 pairs left. Oh, wow. That's all. And then quite marginalized areas that sort of pushed out to sort of the rougher farming areas and some of the islands too, where there's a lot of conservation work being done for them. Yeah. I think it'll remain present as an Irish breeding species, but they won't return to the vast majority of the country because the habitat no longer exists for them. And they're, I suppose, emblematic of the decline we've seen in a lot of farmland birds. Many of our farmland birds are in big trouble. Many of those birds, they're completely unrelated to each other, belong to different families, eat different foods. The common denominator is that they rely on farmland, and the habitat is disappearing. That's it. So one we're very worried about is a beautiful bird called the curlew. It's one of the most iconic Irish birds. It's the largest wading bird we have in Ireland, the waders. It's a brown bird with an incredibly long, down curved beak. So it's very distinctive, and even a few decades ago, would have needed no introduction because everyone in Ireland would be familiar with that species, but it's absolutely vanishing at an alarming rate to the extent that it may be extinct here as a breeding bird within the next 10 years, which is terrifying. We're seeing declines not just in Ireland, but elsewhere in Europe and Asia where this species breeds, and it could be a bird that's headed for extinction. Another bird that we're very worried about is the puffin, everybody's favorite, of which Ireland is very important. We have very important puffin colonies around the Irish coasts. That's a bird that, because of changes in the marine environment, climate change particularly affecting their fish stocks, overfishing is having an impact on them as well. It's predicted that they could be extinct globally within 100 years, which would be an absolute tragedy. It's a species that, I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they get very sad about it because there's something almost like a cartoon character about a puffin. It's like it's an amazing. It's like it's not real, but they are real, and Ireland has a lot of them. But unfortunately, the fewer and fewer of their young are surviving. Their main nesting colonies, the biggest colonies in the world, are actually in Iceland and in Norway, and we're seeing a complete collapse of breeding there. The adults can live for a long time, but they're not producing chicks, and that's not sustainable. So that's a worry. So a lot of our work in Birdwatch Ireland, it centres around the farmland birds and around seabirds. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. There's some real big success stories. We do a lot of work in Birdwatch Ireland, funded through the National Parks and Wildlife Service, also work we do at Dublin Port in Dublin, for birds called terns, T-E-R-N. And we've had an amazing success, particularly with a bird called the roseate tern. On Rockabill Island off the coast of Skerries in North County Dublin, and at Ladies Island Lake in County Wexford. And those are the largest colonies of that species in all of Europe now. Indeed, up to 80% of the European population is on Rockabill Island in Dublin, which is amazing. And my colleague Dr. Stephen Newton and his team, over the course of the last 30 years, they've really managed to change the fortunes for that species. Sadly, this past summer, a lot of these birds were hit by bird flu. So bird flu has become a big problem. It's not something we have to worry about in our gardens with our garden birds. They're not really coming into contact with this disease. But colonial nesters, at sea cliffs and on islands where they're closely packed together, this disease does spread, and it does pose a threat to them. So that's the thing with birds. You can never be complacent. Nothing's ever truly safe. Fortunes can change very rapidly for good or for bad. So that's why constant monitoring is always so important, and why surveys are so important.
Yeah, for sure. I know you guys obviously doing brilliant work, and there's, I suppose, lots of things that people can do to get involved, can help. Just firstly, I'm covering an episode this week on Christmas gift for gardeners, and obviously you guys have a lot of products on your shop, like we spoke about earlier, the foods, proper feeders, proper nesting boxes, and so on. So I think that's worth mentioning. And also, the support that you get from memberships is hugely important to you guys. So tell us all about that.
Oh, with pleasure, and thank you very much indeed. With our shop, we sell a whole range of books and binoculars, telescopes, bird food and feeders, all of these things, toys, and all of the proceeds from that go to support our work as a charity. So all the profits go to support that conservation work, which I think is so important. You mentioned membership there as well, and membership makes a great gift. I'm really passionate about membership because it's really putting your money where your mouth is and voting for nature and showing your support, because all the money we raise from that goes to support our conservation work as well. When people join Birdwatch Ireland, they get a lovely welcome pack with a calendar, a lovely 2024 Irish Birds calendar. We do this every year. We also then have a set of posters, including a garden bird poster, seabird poster. You get information about our 20 nature reserves around the country you can go to. We have over 450 events that you can go to all over the country. We're lucky to have 30 very active, very committed volunteer-run branches around the country that do a whole lot of local work and give us this grassroots support. You get our magazine Wings that comes to you throughout the year in the post, and then for our family and for our junior members, you also regularly get our Bird Detectives Kids magazine as well. You get other free gifts. It's really nice. So you get a lot out of it, but the most important thing is that all the money from that goes to support the conservation work, which is vital. It's what we call unrestricted funding, so it means that we can use that for our priority projects, that the ones that aren't necessarily the ones that the state are going to fund, or that aren't ticking boxes necessarily, ones that we know when we see a decline in a species, or we see something needs action, we don't have to wait then to raise the funding or to beg and borrow for it. We have the money there because of the generosity of our members. That's really important. But also, it's not just about the money. the more members we have, the more clout that gives us when we're looking for support for nature. We're looking for the powers that be to do the right things by Ireland's farmers, for example, to make sure that they're properly supported in their biodiversity measures as they deserve to be, to make sure that, you know, politicians come election time, from whatever party they happen to belong to, they can't ignore the environmental message. They know that Birdwatch Ireland has support, and by becoming a member or joining your friends and family up as members for Christmas, it shows that support in a very real way. So people can find details of all of those things at birdwatchireland.ie. And you'll also find loads of tips there on how to feed the birds, how to identify the birds in your garden, and how to take part in the Irish Garden Bird Survey this winter as well.
Brilliant. You just have to remind me of something else, the events. I know you mentioned, did you say 400 and something events?
Yeah, about 450 a year, yeah.
Brilliant. At the last time we spoke, you used to do a dawn walk, and you weren't sure if it was going to be happening, I think, that year, but does that still happen? And
it does.
Like a 4:30 start or something like that, is it?
Yeah, it depends on where you are in the country. So yes, during COVID, obviously we had to pause those because of the restrictions, but they're back with a bang now. So most of the dawn course events that we run, they're usually in the first 2 weeks of May. That's kind of the peak time for birdsong in Ireland. Yeah. This is it depends on where you are in the country. So this is where, if you happen to be in the west, the further west you are, the more of a lie-in you can have, because the sun rises in the east and the birds are prompted to sing by the first appearance of the sun. So I do. I'm very much involved with the South Dublin branch of Birdwatch Ireland. I've been involved with that ever since I was a child, and I'm lucky enough to be one of the leaders of their walks each May. And we also do I'm very involved with the RTE Dawn Course that Derek Mooney does each May as well. Yeah. And what we find is the Dawn Course events on the East Coast, they normally would have to start around 4 a.m. at that time in May, because that's when the sun is rising. Whereas on the West Coast, maybe around Kerry or Galway, you can get away with a 5 a.m. start because the sun hasn't reached there yet.
Brilliant. It's been, like the last time, really interesting chat. Lots of really valuable information there for people, and lots of great tips, you know, to help and support birds in your garden. And as we said earlier, the benefit is not one way. You know, it's not. There's certainly huge benefit. Obviously, just the visual benefit and the fun of watching birds in your garden, and especially things like goldfinches on the feeders. Watching them having a row, listening to them having a row is great fun. They're very noisy and very boisterous when they're trying to push one another away from the feeder. So that's great fun. But there is the other benefit of, you know, what they're going to in terms of controlling pests in your garden, as part of the natural way, I guess, of a garden. And I certainly have seen the benefits of it, and you will too, by restoring some level of, I suppose, habitat within your garden, and then incorporating that near your vegetable plots and so on. You will see wider benefits. But it has been, as it was the last time, really interesting, and we could chat for a long time, Niall, but we'll sign off there, and thank you very, very much for coming on Master My Garden podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved our chat, and thank you very much indeed.
So that's been this week's episode. Really interesting, as the last episode was. It's been a long time, almost slightly more than 3 years ago now. The information is still the same, you know, but you can see that there is improvements. Like, definitely there was no such thing around here as a woodpecker the last time I spoke to Niall, and 3 years later they're not far away from me. I haven't as of yet seen one in my garden, but they're not far away, which is a good sign. And, you know, other things are becoming obvious as well. For me, having the birds in the garden has a wider benefit, and certainly when it comes to, you know, controlling pests in the vegetable garden, which we talk a huge amount on in the podcast, it has a real benefit that, to be honest with you, a couple of years ago I didn't really know how deep that benefit could be, but it's clear now that it is hugely beneficial. Check out Birdwatch Ireland, support them with their garden survey, support them with their memberships if you can, and they have a shop there for, you know, any sort of bird related gifts or bird watching related gifts. So well worth checking out. And that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.